Start. Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome all of you to the second JB D'Souza Memorial Lecture today. It's a special day for the D'Souza family since it marks the 100th birth anniversary of Bain, as his family and friends called him. Bain, my father-in-law, belonged to the first batch of IAS officers, joining the service in 1947 through the back door, as he put it, since there were some places reserved for people serving in the armed forces and he had been in the Navy. He had a distinguished career in the in the IAS, and continued in important public posts after his retirement. He served as the Municipal Commissioner of Bombay and later also as the Chief Secretary of Maharashtra, and he retired as the Secretary, Ministry of Works and Housing in the Government of India. He had a knack of spotting talent among his juniors and encouraging and helping them. Though some recall him as being strict, everyone, including politicians, recognized him as an upright officer. I remember him for his sense of humor and for wearing his stature lightly. Bain was someone who always stood for the truth, who thought about how he could help the poor and the disempowered. He wrote extensively, and his penciled and fading notes during his first posting in the Punjab during Partition reveal how he fought for equal treatment of all refugees, regardless of religion or country of origin. I am proud to be his daughter-in-law. Being who he was, it is fitting that the second JB D'Souza Memorial Talk be given by someone equally extraordinary. Friends, it's my privilege and honor to introduce to you Mr. Mander. Dr. Mander, a one-time bureaucrat in the IAS, is now a peace and human rights worker, writer, researcher, and teacher, and works with survivors of mass violence, hunger, and homeless persons and street children. He served in the IAS in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, during which time, among other things, he started a leprosy home in Khandwa. He resigned from the IAS in 2002 in protest against the role of the state in the communal massacre in Gujarat, which he believed to be state-sponsored. He has engaged extensively with public policy for justice and equity. For 15 years, he was Special Commissioner to the Supreme Court of India in the Right to Food case, investigating starvation deaths and reviewing implementation and policy change for advancing the right to food and nutrition in several states. He has authored several books on issues of social justice and reconciliation in an India that is now divided by hate and prejudice. As the director of the Center for Equity Studies, he convenes and edits the annual India Exclusion Report, which documents the lives of the disadvantaged in India and attempts through analysis and advocacy for more just and equitable laws and policies. His petitions in the Supreme Court have led to an end to begging as a crime, to making provision of homeless shelters mandatory for every state, and to investigation of cases related to the Gujarat carnage of 2002. Most recently, he has petitioned the court against the detention of people deemed foreigners in Assam in jails in inhumane conditions. He is the founder of Aman Biradari, which works with other people's organizations to promote the values of the Constitution. From late 2017, he has led Karwan-e-Mohabbat, or the Caravan of Love, to counter the rising hate and fear in the country with love and solidarity. We'll now hear briefly from Mrs. Neela D'Souza, Bain's wife of 51 years.
Bain was posted as Bombay's Municipal Commissioner in 1969, and we moved into the residence on Carmichael Road. Not long after, a fire engine with its bells clanged at night. Bain went down to meet them, climbed into the fire engine next to the driver, and went off with them, bells still clanging. I couldn't understand what this was about. He returned several hours later. He had gone with them to the fire they were turning about 8 minutes old. Suddenly, it came to me, what a boost it must have been to the men to have the commissioner with them. That was the kind of man he was.
Over to Mr. Mander now.
Friends, Mrs. D'Souza and family and friends. Uh, it's an enormous privilege today to be invited to speak in a public lecture organized in memory of Mr. J.B. D'Souza, who would have been 100 today. People like Mr. D'Souza were civil servants from an era in the life of our republic when the idealism of the freedom struggle still illuminated and inspired public and social life. As I speak today and as I heard Mrs. D'Souza, I think also of my father, Mr. Mander Singh. He belonged to the same generation of civil servants, was spurred by the same idealism. He died last November. He would have been 95, 7 days from now. Women and men like Mr. D'Souza entered the civil services with the resolve to help build this new nation along the ideals of the freedom struggle and the pledges of our constitution. Later generations owe them an immense debt of gratitude. Mr. D'Souza's work in the IAS and after as an ordinary citizen are shining examples of public service. As a young officer, he helped rehabilitate refugees from Pakistan. He held many prized positions in Maharashtra, heading BEST, the Municipal Corporation, and then as Chief Secretary, all with sterling records of integrity, independence, public compassion, and the kind of solidarity with the working women and men that Mrs. D'Souza just spoke about. But perhaps he's best remembered for his work as an independent citizen in solidarity with the survivors of the Bombay communal carnage of 1992-93 and his efforts to secure justice for them and to restore harmony and trust in society. I turn to our country today. When I look around me, I see the comprehensive betrayal of so many of the pledges and dreams of our freedom struggle and our constitution. I witness these with a troubled heart, with often blindingly moist eyes, and sometimes, which is very rare for me, even the sinking of hope. I will reflect with you today on why I find the state of our republic extremely worrying during the dark times that we are living through at this moment. I will explain why I fear that we are witness today, indeed to nothing less than the calamitous near collapse of our republic. The past months, of course, have been particularly traumatic for the Indian people. Death has touched almost every home, middle class and poor, and every workplace. We have watched the fires and smoke from 24/7 funeral pyres spilling onto sidewalks and parks. Bodies cast by impoverished, broken families into the rivers to be eaten by vultures and stray dogs. We have borne witness to mass graves of hundreds of anonymous bodies. We have seen the agony of so many as their loved ones died, choking for the lack of oxygen, sometimes outside hospitals that refuse them beds, sometimes lonely deaths even inside ICUs. This is grief beyond healing. What we need to recognize is that the great part of these deaths were preventable. They were not caused by the virus. They would have been prevented had the state acted with responsibility, with resolve, with integrity, with farsightedness, with timeliness, and above all, with caring. Despite a year and a quarter to prepare, hospital beds, oxygen supplies, ICU facilities, essential medicines and vaccines were not organized. Instead, the government immersed itself in reckless super spreading events organized for political mileage, massive election rallies, the UP Panchayat elections, and the Kumbh Mela. The last, The Guardian has estimated to be the greatest super spreading event during the pandemic in the entire planet. In a week of the Kumbh, Uttarakhand saw an 1800% rise in infections. When the state did act, it seemed more concerned to preserve private profit than uphold public good. Even as the people are in the throes of the biggest health crisis of a century, it did nothing to prevent cynical profiteering by private hospitals, vaccine producers, insurance companies, ambulance drivers, even sellers of medicines and funeral firewood. The government did little to heed the Council of Science, did not heed its own committee of experts or consult state governments. Instead, it acted with dangerous hubris. These deaths still unfolding during this terrifying second phase of our pandemic, and this immense suffering, fear and despair that these have fostered, with no end in sight so far, are nothing short of crimes against humanity. What the Indian people are enduring at this time of unfolding tumult, we must recognize, are ultimately the wages of electing governments bereft of both competence and compassion, of choosing small-minded bigots of immense hubris as our leaders, and of the failures of all institutions of democracy that should have held the executive accountable. These are crises that have not emerged just with this second phase of the pandemic. As I've argued in my book, Locking Down the Poor, the pandemic and India's moral center, these are problems that plague the whole approach of the government to the pandemic from the start. Recall March 24th, 2020. The Prime Minister comes on television and announces, with about 3.5 hours notice, the imposition of the largest lockdown of the economy on the planet and in human history, with the smallest relief package. As he spoke, he said, we need to do this, we need to stay at home, work from home, keep social distance, wash our hands regularly. And as he was speaking, I kept thinking, he's the Prime Minister of our country. Has he forgotten that the large majority of our people in this country don't have the opportunity to work from home and get a salary? 9 out of 10 workers are informal workers today. And they eat what they earn on a daily basis. What would happen to them? He did not seem to recall, he said to stay at home and keep social distance. What about people who didn't have homes? What about the large majority of our urban populations who live in one-room shanties, 6, 8, 10 people living in a tiny hovel, maybe 100 people sharing a common toilet? What kind of distancing was even possible for them? He talked about washing our hands regularly. How can you wash your hands regularly when you don't have running water? Any morning in a slum, just stand outside on a normal day and see how people crowd around, spending maybe a quarter of their daily earnings on a pot or two of water from tankers. How can they be expected to keep radical sanitation of the kind that was required? I think what you need to understand is that even in its design, the lockdown excluded the poor from any protections. It was not a badly implemented lockdown. It was a lockdown in its very conception, was completely inappropriate for a country with such a large mass of informal workers and people living in subhuman small hovels. And yet this very poor, who were excluded from the protections of the lockdown, on their shoulders were placed the highest burdens of suffering. There was an explosion of livelihood loss and mass hunger almost overnight. I'd just like to show you one film. We were on the streets almost from the second day after after the lockdown. I work with homeless people, and I couldn't bear the thought of what would be happening with them. And this film, a young colleague came with me and shot it, and then we started making a series of short films to tell the world about what was happening. So can we see this first film, Jaha? ये कंपनी बाकी है ना? हाँ, कंपनी देखो सबको पता कि खाना हम लेके आ रहे तभी आए, परसों बोल के आए थे रोज ये खाने के लिए, हमारे खाने के लिए ही बैठे हुए सारे, यही आना होगा।
आप बताइए, जब से 21 तारीख से हमने रोटी का शक्ल नहीं देखा, जो कि इसी हाथ से रोटी बना के देने वाला आदमी। हम कारीगर इंसान हैं, मैं नहीं भत्तेरे कारीगर है। आज 4 दिन से पेट भर का खाना नहीं खाया हमने, मिल ही नहीं रहा।
होटल पे जॉब करता हूँ मैं, नॉर्थ इंडियन डिश बनाता हूँ, जो भी 500-600 मिलते हैं, लेकिन मैं डेली लेता हूँ। फिलहाल होटल बंद नहीं, इसलिए मजबूरी में पड़ा,
मजबूरी से खड़ा रहना पड़ता है।
हाँ,
हम तंदूर का कारीगर हैं हम, ठीक है। 600 रुपये मिलते हैं तंदूर पे, रोज लेते हैं, रोज खाते हैं, रोज कमाते हैं। लेकिन जब आते हैं कमा के, यहीं सोते हैं, यहीं खाते पीते, खत्म हो जाते पैसे, फिर हम जाते हैं। हमारा कोई आधार कार्ड नहीं, कुछ नहीं, कुछ भी नहीं, कोई परिवार नहीं। कहाँ जाएंगे हम यहाँ से?
आप बताओ बाबूजी, मोदी ने ये करवा दिया, हम कहाँ जाएंगे? गरीब आदमी, भूख के मारे बीमारी नहीं होगी इन सबको? बताइए आप, ये कहाँ पे जाएंगे? सब अलग अलग प्रांत के हैं ना, इनको छत छुपाने की जगह बारिश आए तो ना सोने की जगह, सब ऐसे ही हैं बेचारे। और इधर पुलिस मारती है,
इधर बैठो तो इधर से भगाते हैं, बोलते हैं भाग जाओ। ट्रेन बंद है, कहाँ भाग जाऊँ?
घर जाने की कोई व्यवस्था है नहीं है, बॉर्डर सब सील है।
दिल्ली के लॉकडाउन का चौथा दिन है, और जो नेशनल लॉकडाउन है उसका सिर्फ दूसरा दिन है। और जो हालात हमने अभी देखी, वो एक झलक है जो पूरे देश में हो रहा है।
ये थोड़ा सा गरम कम हो जाए, ये गरम ज़्यादा है, तो थोड़ा इंतज़ार कर दीजिएगा। ठीक है, थोड़ा आप इंतज़ार कर दीजिए।
तो हम देख रहे हैं 1000 लोग, 2000 लोग, यमुना पुष्ट में 10,000 लोग इकट्ठा बैठे हैं, 6-6, 8-8 घंटे इंतज़ार कर रहे हैं, और फिर कोई देता है उनको एक मुट्ठी खाना। औरतें जो हैं वो दिख भी नहीं रही हैं। औरतों की हालत, बच्चों की हालत और भी ज़्यादा है, क्योंकि जो इस तरह की भीड़ है उसमें वो शामिल भी नहीं हो पा रहे हैं। 21 दिन लॉकडाउन में उनकी क्या हालत होगी? भूख, अकेलापन, निराशा। कोरोना वायरस बड़ा रोग है, लेकिन उससे बहुत बड़ा रोग है गरीबी और भूख। उन देशों में आप ये लॉकडाउन कर सकते हैं जहाँ पे लोगों के पास घर है, सामाजिक सुरक्षा है, और ऐसी नौकरी है जहाँ उन्हें वेतन मिलता रहेगा। लेकिन हमारे देश में जहाँ 9 में से 10 मजदूर असंगठित हैं, जिनका नौकरी की कोई सुरक्षा नहीं है, उनकी क्या हालत है ये तो हम कल्पना करना भी दूर है।
यहाँ होटल के कारीगर, बर्तन धोने वाले, साफ सफाई वाले, हर कोई मिलता है यहाँ। अच्छा कुक भी मिलता है यहाँ पे, अच्छा खाना बनाने वाला। रैन बसेरे में जगह नहीं है ना, बोलता है जो जितने हैं उतने ही हैं, बोल रहे हैं अब आके आदमी नहीं घुसने देंगे, मारते हैं डंडों से। दाल और चावल आते हैं इतने, वो किसी को नहीं मिलते, बाहर वाले को मिलते ही नहीं है, जो अंदर हैं उन्हीं को मिलते हैं, वो भी थोड़े थोड़े।
हम लोग बिहार से आ रहे थे, नई दिल्ली में गाड़ी रद्द हो गया,
तो बीच में ही फंस गए हैं।
हाँ, जुगी में या पारिक में वो लोग कहा कि रह जाओ हमारे पास, बच्चे के लिए कहाँ भटकेगा, जब हम लोग रोटी वोटी बनाएंगे तो देते रहेंगे। लेकिन वो लोग का काम बंद हो गया, वो भी नहीं कहता है कि हम कहाँ से 1 दिन खिलाएंगे, 2 दिन खिलाएंगे, 1 दिन।
नोटबंदी से ज्यादा परेशानी नहीं, इससे ज्यादा परेशानी।
नोटबंदी में तो था, थोड़ा बहुत मिल तो रहा था
ना, खाना
नोटबंदी में थोड़ा बहुत तो मिल रहा था, यहाँ तो बिल्कुल भी नहीं मिल रहा।
सरकार ने लॉकडाउन कर रखा है, बोलते कि भीड़ नहीं कर इकट्ठा करना, पर वहाँ जाके पुस्तक में देखो हजारों की तादाद में चिपके हुए लोग भीड़ में है, वो इकट्ठा हुए कि हुए, उन्हें भूख लगी, उन्हें पता कि शायद यहाँ खाना मिल जाए, तभी वो वहाँ पर इकट्ठा, पर उस पर कोई ध्यान ही नहीं दे रहा है।
दुष्काल हमने 1943 में देखा। अगर हम ध्यान नहीं दें और पहले से ही अर्थव्यवस्था इतनी मंदी में है, ये नहीं हो कि एक दुष्काल जैसी स्थिति हमारे देश में उठे। ये जो आने वाले दिन हैं, इसमें हम सबको वही गांधी जी की बात याद रखते हुए, उस अंतिम व्यक्ति को ध्यान में रखते हुए, जब हम अपने घरों में अपने आप को सुरक्षित कर रहे हैं, उनकी सुरक्षा के बारे में भी हम लोग सब चिंतित रहें और सरकार से उनकी आवाज़ अपनी आवाज़ से जोड़ के पहुंचाएं कि ऐसी व्यवस्था ना करें जहां जैसे लोग कह रहे हैं कोरोना वायरस तो बाद में मारेगी, पहले भूख हमें मार देगी।
एक टाइम का खिचड़ खाने के लिए कम से कम 9 साढ़े 9 बजे खड़े हो जाओ, बैठे रहो लाइन पे, तो कम से कम 11 बज जाता। बड़े मुश्किल पेट के वजह से जीना पड़ रहा है, अब क्या फ़ायदा।
As a civil servant, I have been witness to mass hunger in the countryside. I was also Commissioner of the Supreme Court for 15 years on hunger and the right to food. But I have never seen in my entire working life this kind of explosion of mass hunger in India's cities. These were the result of the overnight closure, 100% of the entire country, of all demand and all supply. Please understand that even China, where the idea of the lockdown actually first emerged, lockdown at its peak 5% of its population. Also that India, we went to the Supreme Court saying that if the middle classes are getting their salaries sitting at home, the poor should get at least the equivalent of minimum wages, which worked out to about 7,000 rupees per household per month. And it would have cost not more than 3% of India's GDP. Incidentally, India's economic slowdown would have been much slower because there would have been some demand in the economy. But the government refused, the Supreme Court did not give us orders. The result has been, apart from immense human suffering, the complete collapse of our economy that was already in slowdown. It has spawned, we are in the midst of the gravest economic recession after independence. Surveys tell us now that 97% of our people are worse off than they were before the pandemic. Let us not talk about the 3% who have made money many times over during the same period. The hardest impact, however, has been on the laboring poor. Our own survey, Hunger Watch, we did, and we found that 2/3 of vulnerable populations reported eating less than before the pandemic, and they see little hope of coming out of it in the near future. By all estimates, the worst is still to come. But let me not just speak about the pandemic to illustrate the collapse of the republic that I speak of. There's a great deal that I could speak of, and our time is limited. But let me talk about or see this collapse of our republic through the prism of what I see as 3 wars waged by the state against segments of its own people, especially during the 7 years of the present government. The first of these wars is against informal workers. The second is against India's Muslims. And the third is against dissenters and protesters, those who stand with the poor and with minorities. Let me take the first, the silent war with informal workers. Please understand that 70 years plus of us as a republic, and still 9 out of 10 of our workers lack any kind of security of work, any kind of social security, any kind of job protection. 9 out of 10 workers, and these are conscious outcomes of policy choices. Just think that go back to the Prime Minister's announcement of the lockdown. Suppose he told us, we still had the luxury of our large homes, but suppose he told us that you would have no wages paid to you for the period of the lockdown. You would not be able to access the savings in your banks. You would not be able to access your health insurance. How would we have reacted? But that was what was the reality for 9 out of 10 of our workers. I thought that at last now, seeing the distress, the mass movement of distress the largest movement, except the movement of Africans as slaves to the Americas. That is, after that, even greater than a partition was this movement of workers, completely abandoned by the state, abandoned by their employers. The government would respond by, at least at this stage, announcing some policies of labor rights and strengthening labor rights and social protection. But instead, what we have had is a series of ordinances that actually dismantle even the few protections that workers have. Take also the starved public health system as another point of example. India spends among the lowest in the world on public health, a little over 1% of GDP. I was looking at the statistics and was stunned to find that 80% of trained doctors in our country work for the for-profit private health sector. And this is actually an underestimation, because a large number of people trained as doctors in India, often on taxpayers' money, actually migrate overseas. So, and the contribution, up to now, the rich and the middle classes felt they were safe. They had access through their health insurance to world-class hospitals, and they did not care about the complete, starving of public health systems and the exclusion of the poor. But when the pandemic hit us, we can see the outcomes. Even the most generous of estimates say that the private sector has contributed to not more than 10% of the COVID response. And most of that has been at extortionist prices. So what we're seeing is that 20% of trained doctors with a completely broken public health system were left to deal with 90% of COVID. And that is why we are where we are. We wonder why, for instance, the government has not created a huge number of new hospital beds. It had now a year and a quarter to do so. But the truth is that you can create hospital beds, you can convert stadiums, you can convert colleges and schools, all of which are lying empty. You could actually build new structures. But who would run? Who would, where would the trained health personnel come from them if most of them are working for the private health sector? And countries like Spain recognized this and nationalized private health, at least for the period of the global health emergency. And unless we did something like that, if the lives of the poor mattered, that was the only way that we could have provided for them. But I must underline here, and I'll say so later as well, it is not just the result of policies pursued over the last 7 years that we see this complete breaking down of any kind of labor protections and the destruction of public health, public education, and so on. This was a policy pursued vigorously by successive governments, at least over the last 3 decades of neoliberalism, and all of them are culpable together for where we find ourselves today. I spoke about 3 wars that are being waged by this government against its own people, reflecting in what I describe as the collapse of our republic. This second war is against India's Muslims. And here, I want to show you film. We made this 1 year after the violence in Delhi, just before the lockdown. So Jahan, please go ahead.
मज़हब नहीं सिखाता आपस में बैर रखना, मज़हब नहीं सिखाता आपस में बैर रखना, गुलिस्तां ये बुलबुलों का कांटों से दूर रखना, गुलिस्तां ये बुलबुलों का कांटों से दूर रखना, मज़हब नहीं सिखाता आपस में बैर रखना। मज़हब नहीं सिखाता। देखा था एक सपना, एक जहां ऐसा भी है जहां जिक्र सिर्फ मोहब्बत का ही है। होश जब खुले तब ये जाहिर हुआ, शायद ये तो फकत एक सपना ही है। सारे जहां से अच्छी क्या यही वो ज़मीं है, बेकसूरों के खून से यूं जो रंगी है। इतना भी सस्ता इंसान का खून सींचो तुम इससे हुकूमते अपनी। सुर्ख रंग गुलिस्तां पर फैला दिया, क्यों सुर्ख रंग गुलिस्तां पर फैला दिया। फिर भी है मेरा यही बयान, मज़हब नहीं सिखाता आपस में बैर रखना। गुलिस्तां ये बुलबुलों का कांटों से दूर रखना। गुलिस्तां ये बुलबुलों का कांटों से दूर रखना।
Friends, the second battle that I spoke about with regard to and the belonging of India's Muslims in this country is not a new one. It dates back at least 100 years or more. Uh, 100 years ago was when South Africa and took leadership of our freedom struggle. And in the 3 decades that he led our freedom struggle, there was a certain imagination of the country that we would build after the British left. Central to that idea was the idea that we would build a country where it would not matter which God you worship, or if you worship no God. It would not matter what caste you belong to, what language you spoke, what gender you had, whether you were rich or poor. In every respect, each person who chose to make this country their own would be a full equal citizen with equal rights, equal belonging. That was, this humane, inclusive nation was the nation that illuminated our freedom struggle in the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. And it was this same idea written into our constitution, again under the leadership of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. But these 100 years ago, firstly with the Hindu Mahasabha, and then in 1925 with the formation of the RSS, there was a very different imagination for this country. They believed that India belonged primarily to its Hindu co-religionists, perhaps the caste Hindu co-religionists, and others, particularly Muslims, Christians, and Dalits and Adivasis, could live in this country, but only as second-class citizens with lesser rights. The early leaders of the RSS were frank and open in their admiration for Nazi Germany and for the politics of Adolf Hitler. There was a third stream that arose, which Muslim League nations, and a Hindu India and a Muslim Pakistan, and they were minority, could not get equality of justice, of opportunities for livelihood, of protection against violence, and so on, unless they had a country in which they were in the majority. And as we know, in the end, my own family was among those who were displaced. My parents had been raised in Rawalpindi, and my entire childhood I would hear stories and watch the suffering over a generation that this partition resulted in. So we, in the early years, and when I talk about somebody like in the generation of civil servants like Mr. D'Souza, belong to a period of idealism in the building of our nation, and this conviction that this country would be one that belonged equally to people of every faith and every caste. That state. I grew up, I was born 7 years after independence, and I remember a childhood very, very different from the childhood. I have a grandson now, 3 years old, and he's growing up in a very different India. I do not recall in my entire childhood hearing bigotry or anti-Muslim kinds of conversations in my family. I didn't hear them in my school. I didn't hear them on television. I didn't watch that on cinema. It was just not acceptable. And there was bigotry. Of course, there was bigotry, but it was in the margins, in the shadows. Today, my grandson is growing up in an India where as soon as he begins to make sense of his world, he will hear bigotry everywhere. He will hear it among his, in his extended family. He will hear it in school. He will, hear and learn it in social media, in the discourses of our political leaders. And it is that challenge that I think that we need to locate where we are today. Today, India is, is led by, all the people in all the, highest constitutional positions in our country today have spent their entire adult life as committed members of the RSS. And we must admit and recognize, right or wrong, that they have an imagination for this country, which is very different from that idea of humane, equal, inclusive citizenship that was imagined and promised in our freedom struggle and in our constitution. This government has taken this battle against its Indian Muslims to a very decisive level. I see three parts to this battle. The first was the political battle. Political scientists never tired of telling us that a government, political party cannot come to power which is openly hostile to India's Muslims, because India's Muslims constitute a significant part of the population in a large number of constituencies. But the BJP set out to establish that if they unite everybody across religion and across caste, including Dalits, including Christians, against what is seen as a common enemy, which is India's Muslims, then you can come to power, get a majority, in an openly anti-Muslim platform. And that is what they succeeded in doing. And as a consequence of that, I find that even the so-called secular opposition is more and more raising questions, even through to equal citizenship. The second battle was a social battle, as I see it. It was a battle which sought to normalize and even valorize hatred and bigotry against India's Muslims. It came very far from the shadows that it existed in my childhood to become center stage, normal and even patriotic. Runaway hate speech by BJP leaders, it has been documented that it increased by several 100% in this period. Open hate speech led from the very top. Hate speech of the kind that actually by Indian law should lead to their prosecution and the imprisonment. There have been attempts to stigmatize and erase all parts of India's Islamic legacy, renaming roads, cities, demolishing of mosques, the recasting of Muslim majority Kashmir and now Lakshadweep are recent examples. But I think the most visible, dramatic manifestation of this social war against India's Muslims was reflected in the alarming rise of lynchings. We started seeing young, 7 years ago exactly, a young, visibly Muslim man, a few days after the new government came into power, was lynched on the streets of Pune. And since then, we've seen, a young boy traveling on a train, being lynched, people being lynched in the name of cow slaughter, love jihad. The numbers are not enormous, but there are very worrying parallels with the spate of lynchings that we saw of African Americans in America from the late 19th century right up to the 1960s. A historian writing about lynchings in America spoke about how every lynching was actually 1,000 lynchings, which reverberated across the land, across the rivers, across the mountains, across the deserts, and settled as fear in the heart of every African American. I would say that every lynching in India is like 10,000 lynchings, which reverberate across the land, across the rivers, across the mountains, across the forests, across the deserts, to settle as abiding fear in the hearts of India's Muslims. The lynchings of African Americans were, one thing that was very significant about them also was that they were performative acts of hate violence. They were like large picnics. People gathered with families and watched the dismemberment and the beating to death and the hanging of African American. Today, that same performative hate violence has been replaced with a video camera. Almost every single incident of lynching is gleefully videotaped by the perpetrators of the violence, and is circulated widely. It's widely consumed on social media. The fact that you are filming yourself committing crimes which by the law of the land could lead you to the gallows or keep you behind prison bars for the rest of your life. The fact that you're filming yourself committing these crimes means many things. One is that you're assured of your impunity. You're assured that actually instead of being stigmatized and sent to jail, criminalized, you will become heroes of the Hindu nation. But it's also sending a very clear message to all Muslims that this is what you can be reduced to. I was deeply disturbed by what I saw as large collective silence, by and large, after lynching after lynching after lynching in this country. It seemed that the large majority of Hindu Indians consented to this performative violence. And so I made a call for what I called Karwane Mohabbat, or a caravan of love. And I said, can I appeal to my countrywomen and men to join me in a journey that we will make. And we promised that we would visit the homes of every family anywhere in the far corners of our country where somebody has been lost to lynching. And we would go there to tell them 3 or 4 things. The first is to say, you are not alone, that there are many people in this country who share in your pain and in your suffering. The second thing that we wanted to say, and we said, was that we seek forgiveness for what you have suffered, because we also share responsibility for what our country has become. The third thing that we wanted to, we said we would tell the families, was that we are with you as you rebuild the broken pieces of your life, as you fight for justice, and we will tell your story. We'd set off first for 1 month in 2017, traveling across 8 states. And a large number of writers, filmmakers, human rights workers, young people volunteered. We started off from Assam. We ended up in Gujarat, in Porbandar, the birthplace of Mahatma Gandhi. But we found it had so much impact. It meant so much to the people who were living with this hate violence, that we decided that we would continue. And right up to the lockdown, for 3 years, every month we would set out. We made about 30 journeys to more than 14 states. But many things stayed with me. And this is when I talk about this social battle. People would tell us, families would tell us, I wish they just shot him. I wish they just stabbed him to death. Why did they have to torture him so much? Why did they have to gouge out his eyes? Why did they have to smash his genitals? Why did they have to cause him so much pain? Where is all this hatred coming from? I would, almost begging them say, somebody surely came to help you. And the answer was always that no one came. No one came. We were completely alone. The police would, in almost every case, far from protecting them, often, encourage the violence. And after the violence, would actually register cases against them, against the victims, and do everything to not allow punishment to reach the actual perpetrators. In a few cases, when the perpetrators did go to jail, there was one in Jharkhand where when they were released on bail, there were crowds outside to receive them with garlands. They were taken to a union minister's home where he garlanded each of these perpetrators of violence. This is really the success of this second, the political battle, the social battle. And then there was a third phase to this. The Modi government, when it went back to seek a mandate in 2019, it was in a very different position from 2014. In 2014, there was the history of what had happened in Gujarat, but there was also enormous disillusionment with the failures of the Congress government. There were the promises that we would do great work for the economy, we would create millions of jobs, we would end corruption. And some part of the vote share that came for the BJP government in 2014 was was a vote for hope and for change. But by 2019, the economy was in shambles. There was very little job creation. Crony capitalism was at a high. India's farm sector was in even deeper crisis. This second mandate was really clearly a mandate of hate, a hate for India's Muslims within and for Pakistan out without. And when the government ended up with an even higher vote share of 37.6% of votes, it is significant that 36% of this 37.6 was votes by Hindu voters. This represents a consolidation and a radicalization of India's Hindus. This was seen as a mandate for the government now, not just to transform India in its politics and in its social common sense, but to transform India even in law and in the constitution. There were rapid steps taken, Article 370 with regard to Kashmir, the triple talaq law, which actually criminalized Muslim men in a very, very, very peculiar way. A Hindu man who abandons his wife with or without saying talaq is not subject to any criminal action, but a Muslim man is. And then there was the Supreme Court judgment around the Ram temple. All of this seemed, there was still light after the lynchings and so on. There seemed to be a silent acceptance, even approbation by the majority of the Indian people. And so the government went in finally in December 2019 for a decisive further step in the transformation of India into the alternative imagination of an India of unequal citizenship, with second-class citizenship for India's Muslims. And this was through the amendments in India's citizenship law and the NRC and the NPR. There was, this was seen, and they had not expected the kind of resistance that arose. And I'll come to that. But I spoke about three enemies, and to understand the collapse of our republic in the light of the war against these three internal enemies. The first was India's working poor. The second was India's Muslims. The third were all voices and movements of dissent. Those who stood with the working poor, with Muslims, stood for the constitution, stood for the idea of secularism, stood for the ideas of equality and equal justice. We have seen how anti-terror extraordinary laws like the UAPA and the NAC have been used. Within a few days, it will be three years since people were detained under UAPA, claiming that they were part of a conspiracy to kill the Prime Minister and create massive unrest in Bhima Koregaon. And among the people who have been arrested are some of the most respected human rights workers, thinkers, academics, poets, writers. And then we saw the Delhi violence. Here again, it's extraordinary that the government, the Delhi police, has created a separate FIR 59, in which it claims that the violence in Delhi was the result of a conspiracy of a group of urban Naxals, which incidentally includes me in affidavits to both the High Court and the Supreme Court. The Delhi police has claimed, and in a number of charge sheets, that we had gathered and we had planned an insurrection, a violent insurrection. And a number of young people are already in jail, again, indefinitely. Idealistic young people. We've seen the taming of the media. We've seen the refusal of the judiciary to provide justice, even when we have an 84-year-old Jesuit priest who is who has Parkinson's, who's never been to Bhima Koregaon, who has spent his life for the rights of, in a small room, working for the rights of Adivasi people. He had to move courts after court to get a sipper because his hand shook so much that he couldn't drink water. I just got news that he's been detected as positive with COVID, and I fear very much for what is going to happen to him. This is penalty by process over and over again. Sudha Bhardwaj, when I was a collector in Chhattisgarh, I used to watch her with enormous admiration. This is a woman who was born in the US. She could have had leading a comfortable life in the US. Instead, she chose to come to Chhattisgarh, work with the mine workers, and she is loved and revered by them. There's the jailing of journalists. Somebody comes from Kerala to report on a gang rape of a young teenage Dalit girl and her killing, and he has been in jail for now 9 months. The few officials who, the fewer and fewer officials today who stand up and offer independent advice, and they are punished and sidelined. We see the destruction of the institutions of an independent civil service. We see the willingness of the police to be used as petty instruments of the unconstitutional political agenda of the ruling party. Some months back, the Uttar Pradesh Chief Minister called a meeting of the senior-most police officers on love jihad. And I was amazed that without demur, they all gathered, and an ordinance has been passed investigating consensual adult relationships of love, romance, friendship between Muslim men and Hindu women. We've seen the failure of the higher judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, to actually defend the rights of minorities. The 160 odd petitions against the CAA laws, for instance, including one that I am part of, and the courts haven't even begun to hear them. We must, learn lessons from Nazi Germany. Democracy is not only about the will of the majority. Hitler was elected duly by electoral processes. He was loved and adored by the majority, and we saw where it took us. Democracy is equally about the protection and the rights of minorities. And look at where we have brought them. Who is responsible for bringing our republic to this state of collapse? Arundhati Roy, when she spoke about COVID, said something quite wonderful. She said, COVID-19 is not just a virus, it's also an X-ray. It reveals what kind of society we have built and become. So what does it reveal? It reveals not just a government that has so profoundly failed its people. Even more culpably, it reveals a spectacularly uncaring middle class who choose and applaud these leaders and their policies. The current pandemic is exceptional because it has brought grief and bereavement even to the homes of well-networked middle classes. We thought we would never be touched. But the same middle classes have applauded for too long majoritarian and market-friendly policies that they believed would protect their interests. They do not care about the exclusion or even open hostility and suffering to the laboring poor and to the minorities. The problem, therefore, is not just of the government. It is of the people who elect and support these governments and their policies. We need to emphasize that the collapse of the Republic is not just also the handiwork of the present Union government, although it has hastened this collapse. There's a major culpability for India arriving at this point in its journey as a republic, with most of the political establishment across most of the political spectrum. Look at the role of the Congress party and various other parties in communal riots, in the targeting of innocent Muslims for years, even decades, misusing anti-terror laws. Right through the 90s and early 2000s, we saw, similar to what is happening with dissenters today, young Muslim men being put away in jails in anti-terror laws. 15 years later, 20, 25 years later now, each of them are being released, acquitted as innocent. Who is going to bring back? Who is responsible? And this has happened under successive governments. The partisan misuse of the police, the judiciary, the various institutions of countervailing power to the executive, and the media that have all but collapsed today. These governments have been accused by the BJP famously of appeasement of Muslims, which they are seeking to correct. But the truth is that the only appeasement that successive governments have done has been not of Muslims, not of Hindus as ordinary people. The appeasement has been of hate-mongering elements in every religious community. That is the appeasement that successive governments have done. The policies of neoliberalism have also destroyed public health, public education, labor rights, social security. This is a common culpability as well. The last thing I wanted to say was to ask, do I see hope that we will be able to reclaim our republic, rebuild the humane and inclusive country imagined during our freedom struggle and promised in our constitution? My hope does get often clouded by despair these days, but I still can hope for some reasons. The first is the acts of resistance in these dark, built around immense courage, peace, and non-violence, and the idea of solidarity. The peaceful anti-CA protests, none of us saw it coming. They arose spontaneously across the country. The opposition was not just to a 1,000-word law. It was about these very questions. Who does this country belong to? Who does it not? On what terms? India was founded as a humane, inclusive country that would belong equally to people of every faith. Will it remain so? These were the questions that people asked. Colleges, universities across the country, young people stood up. I traveled for most of those 100 days across the country. I would love to see this uprising of peaceful expression of solidarity. The posters, there was one poster I particularly loved where it said, "You divide, we multiply." Another young woman had put up a poster saying, two words that break my heart. And those two words were "except Muslim." A young Hindu lawyer in Jabalpur, when the Prime Minister taunted the protesters saying, "I can recognize them by the clothes they wear," he traveled by train to Delhi and came to us at Jantar Mantar. It was freezing winter. And what he did was he undressed down to his boxer shorts and he held up a poster telling the Prime Minister, "Now try to guess who I am by looking at my clothes." And he wanted to make a point in solidarity. It got colder and colder. We kept telling him, "It's done now. You put on your clothes." And he said, "No, I have to say this to the Prime Minister." We saw, weddings in many parts of the country. Carol singers in Kerala wearing hijabs and skull caps. Muslim protesters in Christmas wearing Santa Claus caps. There were many ways, and most of all, the significance of holding up the Constitution, the national flag, and the national anthem as icons of this movement of protest. I remember a day after, I mean, the night when the police entered Jamia Millia University in the library, beat up young students who were completely, shattered and broken. Many of us gathered through the night, outside the police station and outside the police headquarters, spontaneously demanding that each of those students be released. Next day, December 16th, a huge number of students, very, very anguished, had gathered in thousands in Jamia Millia, and I got frantic calls saying I must come and speak. And I went there and I spoke and I said many things. I mean, that this is not a battle against this one law. It's a battle about what kind of country do we want to leave to our children. Is it one that is founded on love, or is it one that is founded on hate? I said to India's Muslims that do not ever allow now in future anyone to question your love for this country and your loyalty to this country. Least of all, people who've never took part in the freedom struggle. I said, you are, the rest of us are Indian by chance. We didn't have any other country to choose. Your parents, your grandparents had a country built around the idea of religion as central to your identity. And they chose India, which was built around the idea of equal respect for every religion. So you are Indian by choice, we are Indian by chance. And that we must battle, but battle with love. We cannot counter hate with hate. And it is not as if people did not understand this. The farmers' protests, I don't have time to talk about them, but they, you just have to walk there and see how, at every step, people have gathered. Somebody is giving you a langars. Some young people have gathered and say, we'll clean your clothes, we'll wash your clothes, we'll iron your clothes, we'll polish your shoes. There are doctors, everybody is there gathered, providing free service across religion, across caste, across community, in the act of struggle. I draw hope from the immense acts of kindness when the state effectively abandoned its people during the pandemic. Everywhere, we've seen just wonderful examples of people providing food, oxygen, langars, helping people with, cremate bodies, bury bodies during both phases of the pandemic. There's a story particularly close to my heart where this this police officer, he's a Christian police officer, he died. His daughter and wife were both had COVID. The body was in a mortuary. When they finally could come and collect the body, nobody was willing to carry the body. They were desperate. They didn't know what to do. They had the number of a Muslim auto rickshaw driver whom they used to sometimes call. They called him and he said, I was frightened, but these two women were in such desperate need. So he came. They carried the body on the auto rickshaw. They reached the burial ground, and the priest was too frightened to come and say the prayers. Who would dig the grave? So this Muslim auto rickshaw driver found a Hindu grave digger, and together they dug the grave, and they gave a respectful farewell to the man who had died. That, to my mind, is the India that still gives me hope. The hope of a country that is just, that is kind, that is equal, that is welcoming to people of every faith, caste, gender, language, assuring them equal rights. A country of freedom of worship, of freedom of dissent, freedom from fear, freedom from want. I think that I derive hope most of all from the fact that every second Indian today is below the age of 25. We are home to the largest number of young people in the world. It is they that have to decide the country that they wish to leave for their children. My generation inherited a country that we made a huge mess of. They have to decide what country they want to build, to grow up and grow old in, and to give to their children. And I hope hope desperately that they will reclaim our republic as imagined in the freedom struggle, as promised in our constitution. A truly free, a truly inclusive, a truly kind, a truly equal, a truly just nation. We will rebuild it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mander. This is Dilip, JB's son, speaking. Would you be willing to take just one or two questions from the audience? We've had a number of questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm just going to pick one or two at random. There's a Girish Gogia who's asked, Harsha, why are the institutions that should be stopping all of this hand in hand with the government? What do you make of that?
See, I think there are many explanations. There is a climate of fear that has been created. There's also, I think the government has used multiple tactics. We've just seen, for instance, the National Human Rights Commission. In 2002, when I left the IAS after the Gujarat massacre, I believe that this was India had plunged into darkness, and I saw where we were going. But when I look back, that was still an India in which, despite whatever happened, we had the media that was independently reporting very, very powerfully. We had the National Human Rights Commission led by Justice Verma, with whom I worked closely, and who did a great deal to secure and fight for justice. We had civil society groups which went and produced a number of fact-finding reports. We had, some very fine police officers like Rahul Sharma, who stood up and showed what was possible in those times. We had the Supreme Court passing a number of very important judgments for justice. Today, we find none of these working. And what really has gone wrong is something that I think we all need to collectively reflect upon. Why have, it is true that the government, I mean, in the appointment of the National Human Rights Commission chairperson, Justice Mishra, I mean, it is so brazen that it was meant to be, by law, a retired Chief Justice. There are 3 retired Chief Justices who could have been appointed, but they amended the law saying that any retired Supreme Court judge could be appointed. And this is one judge who, went on record praising Mr. Modi as one of the great visionary leaders that he's ever seen, and so on. He's passed a number of extremely questionable judgments. He is handpicked to head the National Human Rights Commission. It marks its sort of ultimate demise. Why has so much of the media allowed itself to be silenced? There's so much self-censorship. There's so little questioning. So few hard questions are asked. Why has the judiciary refused to play the role that it was meant to play? When I talked about Nazi Germany, who would defend the rights of minorities in a majoritarian context? The judiciary had a central role for this. So I think that we see the collapse of the independence of the civil service. I've been a civil servant. I spent 3 years also at the academy where I would teach new recruits to the civil service. And I decided that my first lecture to civil servants would be the right and the duty of a civil servant to dissent. I would say that your duty is not to obey blindly. You are a servant first of the Constitution, secondly of India's poor people, and only last the servant of the elected government. And be true to your conscience. And I have seen that it was possible to do so. And you see less and less of that happening today. You see some very fine examples of people who've still shown their humanity, shown their independence. But we have, by and large, watched almost every segment of civil society silenced into submission, into complicity. And I think it's a reflection of the larger problem of what's happened to middle class India. The collapse of its moral center.
Let's take one more question, Mr. Mander. This is from Alin Jayant. What do you think are the reasons for the deep-seated enmity among Hindus that allowed the BJP to fan these flames of hatred?
It's a great question. I think about it a lot. When I speak about the importance of living together with harmony and unity, after 2002, after I took the step that I felt I needed to take, I suddenly found I'd lost about 80% of my friends, relatives, people I'd grown up with, my extended family, my childhood friends, my friends from school, and so on and so forth, my friends from the service. And I realized how widespread was this sense of bigotry that has become increasingly our common sense. I don't think we've dealt with that period of our history in the way that we should. I look at Germany, for instance, and how it's dealt with its Nazi past. Successive generations have asked their parents, their grandparents, how did you allow this to happen? And children are not allowed to forget the consequences of the politics of hate. In India, we haven't done that. There were, a massacre of 1 million people, almost equally between, Hindus and Sikhs on one side and Muslims on the other. I remember speaking once in Punjab on some of these questions, and an old man got up and said, how do you expect me to free my heart from hate? My family, this is what happened to us in Partition. This is what the Muslim mobs did to us. How can I overcome my hate? So I said, what can I tell my children? So I said that if you have to tell your children the story, at least tell them the full story. Because where Muslims were in a majority, this is what they did to the Hindus. But where Hindus and Sikhs were in a majority, this is exactly what they did to Muslims as well. So if you feel you need to tell the story, tell the full story. But there are other ways of dealing with this legacy of hatred. And I recall, those, the moments of Mahatma Gandhi, I think the finest moments of his life, when India was celebrating her freedom. Gandhiji was not in Delhi, he was in Calcutta, deeply worried by, enormous amount of Hindu-Muslim violence. Finally, he went on this epic 40-day fast. And people say how day after day after day, the violence started ebbing and it came to a standstill. A story is told about a man who came, a Hindu man, very angry. And he came to Gandhiji and said, what you're doing is terribly wrong. But he threw a roti on his face and said, eat this because I cannot take your death on my, on my conscience. But what you're doing is wrong. So Gandhiji said, why? And he said, I had a child, a son this small, and Muslim mobs killed him. So how do you expect me to overcome my hate and my pain? And Gandhiji said, I understand your hate and your pain, but if you really want to overcome it, find a little boy this small, a Muslim boy whose parents were killed by Hindu mobs, and adopt this child as your own child. Raise him like you would have raised your own son, but in his own faith. And maybe then you will find the spaces to overcome your hate. I don't think we have leaders who teach us this. I don't think, as a generation, this is what we are teaching our children. And this is where I think we've lost our way. A lot of my extended family, for instance, was very hostile to me after 2002. And they would come up to me and say, how could you, take the wrong side after all that we have suffered? And I said that precisely because we have suffered so much, I have to take the side of those who are suffering the same hate and violence today. So I am on the right side. It is you who are on the wrong side. Can't you see that? And so I think that, when I look, leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, I think, brought out, we are all a mixture of, good and bad. I think Mahatma Gandhi was the kind of leader who brought out our goodness collectively and individually. We have leaders today who are bringing about what is worst in us. They are encouraging our hatred and our bigotry. And it is something that we have to learn to fight. People do tell me, where are we going to find a leader like Mahatma Gandhi? My answer is we have to find them within ourselves, and they're all around us. And may I end actually with one story that I encountered during the Karwane Mohabbat. We'd gone to Asansol, where there was again hate violence and a bit of a communal riot around Ramnamni processions. And as happens classically in communal violence, when things settled down, they found that 2 Hindu boys had got trapped in the Muslim area, and 1 Muslim boy had got trapped in the Hindu majority area. And the hostage situation was, you give back our children, we'll give back our children. There was an Imam, Rashidi, who said, this is completely wrong. There can be no conditionalities. What would the parents of these 2 Hindu children be suffering? And they must be sent back unconditionally in safety. And so the children were restored. The Muslim boy who was trapped in the Hindu community was the son of Imam Rashidi, 16 years old. He waited for the child to be returned, and he waited and he waited. It was around midnight. He was alone in the mosque. All from the officers saying, we have found your son, but we're really sorry. He's been killed. And Imam Rashidi's first response, spontaneous, is, don't let anybody know about this. I will tell the people about what has happened. Otherwise, the city will burn. And he then, in the morning prayers, he goes to the mosque, and after the prayers, he says, you will have noticed that my son is not with me. This is what has happened to him. But, and he immediately says, but my appeal to you is, that my son's death is a great tragedy. But if you kill a single Hindu in revenge for my son's death, it will be for me a much greater tragedy. And many young men, when we were in Asansol, told me that they'd grown up as children listening to the Imam, and they were all in tears. And they listened to him, they took his words to heed. And instead of killing Hindus, they went and they had little pockets of Hindu settlements in the area. They went and stood guard, made sure that no harm would come to any Hindu in that area. And at around 11 o'clock, they gave him the son's body. The body was not just, he hadn't just been killed, as I was describing that. He'd been tortured, he'd been half burnt, but the Imam was completely unshaken. And he stood with his resolve for love. And when I met him some days later, I asked him, he said, I've spent my entire life, adult life, teaching the values of peace, of compassion, of forgiveness, which I feel is the essence of the teachings of my religion. And when my turn came, if I slipped, what would be the meaning of my life? And so, I saw so many parallels between what he said and what Mahatma Gandhi had said. And so I think there is Mahatma Gandhi and what is best in the radical love that he taught us and he lived for and he actually died for among all of us. And it is claiming that idea of radical love. In Shaheen Bagh, the women of Shaheen Bagh, working class women, a union minister raised a slogan, "Desh ke gaddaron ko goli maro salon ko." All the traitors of this nation, shoot them, whatever. And the women decided that we will give a return slogan to them. And their return slogan was, "Desh ke sab pyaron ko," all you beloved people, people who were asking for them to be should. "Desh ke sab pyaron ko phool barsa ko," shower each of them with flowers. So I think it is in reclaiming this idea of love, of solidarity, of fraternity, that we will be able to pick up the broken pieces of our republic and fight the common sense of hate that we are being fed with.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Mander. I'm going to ask my sister Meena to give a final vote of thanks. Meena, it's now yours.
Bain, the name that my father was universally known by, was a man of great accomplishments. As his daughter, however, I was also witness to many small things he did that have stayed with me over the years and informed my life. Along those lines, I'm reminded of a story told to us by my Auntie Pat, my father's sister, who visited us when I was a teenager in Hyderabad many decades ago. She told us about running into a young neighbor on his way back from work one evening. He had been waiting in a long line for the elevator that morning at the Mantralaya, when an older gentleman arrived and stood behind him. A small commotion ensued, whereupon this newcomer was asked by everyone to proceed to the head of the line. The gentleman firmly refused and waited patiently until it was his turn. Upon hearing this, my Auntie Pat interjected and said, "That would be my brother." "No," said the neighbor, "he could not have been." "I assure you that is him," replied my aunt. A week later, the young man returned to admit that he had made inquiries and she was right. It was indeed her brother. He was flabbergasted that a senior IS officer would line up for the elevator just like everyone else. Bain also had a tremendous sense of humor, which he injected in all aspects of his life. He took on an assignment to run Jaslok Hospital after his retirement from the IAS. On one occasion there, he received a memo saying that all the chairs in the waiting room had to be replaced. "Why?" he asked. "Because they are old," came the response. Without missing a beat, he replied, "So am I." On this occasion of his 100th birthday, I remember my father with love and admiration. It is entirely befitting that Dr. Harsh Mander is the speaker at the centennial celebration of my father's life. I know that he had the highest regard for Dr. Mander and would have been delighted to be present today to hear the talk. Dr. Mander, we are deeply grateful that you accepted our invitation to speak on this occasion. You have given us much to think about. I also thank you for being patient as we worked on a way to make this lecture happen. Thank you to Mr. Chandrapur for his help with technical details. Thank you to each and every one of you for being here with us to commemorate this 100th birthday of my father.